Okay, I think we are live at the moment, both on Zoom and on YouTube. I can see lots of participants joining us on the attendees box, which is very, very populated. So it's lovely to see so many people joining us from all sorts of places. As far as I can see, some familiar names and some not. So welcome everyone. Okay, I think we are live at the moment, both on Zoom and on YouTube. I can see lots of participants joining us on the attendees box. And that means that actually it's all working, which is good. Okay, so back to the sharing screen. I need to learn how to do this. I need to learn how to join us to YouTube without YouTube playing in the background, but we'll get there eventually. Anyway, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Dimitra Femi, and I am co-director of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here at the University of Glasgow. My specialism is on fantasy and children's literature, and I have worked extensively on J.R.R. Tolkien, which is how I first became interested in this book. We're celebrating today David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, which is 100 years old this year. As we will hear later from our panelists, this book may have not been a huge publishing success in its time, but its legacy on later fantasy authors, including J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Philip Pullman, has been immense. At the same time, Lindsay's Scottish heritage and the fact that the interstellar journey in the novel begins from an observatory here in Scotland makes the University of Glasgow a particularly fitting venue to celebrate this extraordinary book. So I'll come back to all of this as I briefly introduce this novel to you, but let me go through a few housekeeping things first. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a second. First of all, it's absolutely lovely to see so many people, as I said before, from everywhere in the world joining us either on Zoom or via YouTube. This evening, I'm saying, but it might be morning or afternoon for you, wherever you are. I just want to go quickly through our running order. So as I said a minute ago, I will first introduce the book. I will also introduce our esteemed panelists who are joining us from here in the UK and the USA. Then each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will take questions from all of you and begin what I know will be a lively and very rich discussion. For your questions, please use the Q&A function. Feel free to use the chat to register reactions or to share thoughts. I can see it already going a little bit crazy, which is good to see. But with so many of us present, it's impossible to monitor both. So if you can use, for questions to our panelists, if you can use the Q&A, I'd be very, very grateful. And since I mentioned the chat, it would be lovely, as we usually do, to get a sense of where everyone in the world is that are watching us right now. That's the pleasures of an online event. So if you could share on the chat where you're watching us from, and those of you that are watching us on YouTube, if you can share on the comment section there, that would be great. That'll be lovely. If you want to live tweet during this event or share any reactions on Twitter, please use the hashtag Arcturus100 and also the hashtag BeingHuman2020. And I'll talk about the Being Human Festival in a second. Many of you will also know about our Discord server, and those of you that are already using our Discord server will have a chance to also have a conversation as the event is going on there, but also to continue the conversation afterwards. So that's the benefits of having this ongoing thing going at the same time. So as I hinted before, this event is part of a the National Being Human Festival, which is taking place across the UK from the 12th till the 22nd of November. Being Human is the only national festival of the humanities run by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Events are mostly online this year for obvious reasons, and you can see the full program online at www.beinghumanfestival.org. And the festival can be found on @BeingHumanFest on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. And as I said before, the hashtag for any Being Human Festival event is hashtag BeingHuman2020. Please, we will ask you to help the festival keep as many events as possible free and to improve the festival for years to come, but taking a moment at the end of this to fill in a feedback survey that will come to you via Eventbrite, because that's how, you know, this festival has really improved and developed through all of this feedback from previous years, and it would be lovely to have your views as well. Finally, if you'd like to support the Being Human Festival by making a donation, there is a donation link on the main website /supportus. Just to say that some of the links that I've been talking about through this introduction are already on the chat for those of you there that want to check them out. So back to David Lindsay and A Voyage to Arcturus. Now, the novel was Lindsay's first and was published by Gollancz in 1920. It begins in a London séance, during which a being from another world, another planet, is conjured. Our protagonist, Maskell, a kind of giant, as he is described by the narrator's voice, together with his friend Nightspore, well, sort of friend, acquaintance is probably a better term, are invited by the rather dark and mysterious crag to Starkness Observatory in Scotland to travel to Tormance, the only inhabited planet in the region of Arcturus, and witness its marvels. There are clear Wellesian resonances in the mechanics of the space travel. They travel by back rays, so light rays that are attracted back to their source. And Maskell eventually finds himself waking up on Tormance on his own with no sign of Nightspore or crag. And from that point on begins a series of encounters with strange beings, landscapes, animals, and plant life. There are really imaginative world-building elements here. The changing landscapes of Tormance are vividly described, and Lindsay even invents two new colors for his purposes, Ulfire and Jail, which are not described in terms of visual cues. How could one do that? But in terms of the impression and emotional reaction that they cause. Ulfire is wild and painful, while Jail is dreamlike, feverish, and voluptuous. So you can see the sort of how the imagination goes wild after this. As the reader gradually realizes, the creatures and beings Maskell encounters and the changing landscapes he traverses represent different philosophical systems, and often the worldviews expressed in each encounter are accompanied by some physical change in Maskell's own body. We will see an example of that in the illustrations I will show in a minute. All of these strange, sometimes marvelous, sometimes eerie and disturbing encounters lead inexorably to a big revelation at the end, which ties everything in the novel together and puts forward a particular understanding of life, the universe, and everything. So we will hear a lot more from our panelists, but let me first share some of the novel's covers over the years, with many thanks to Douglas A. Anderson for sharing his extensive archive, as well as some illustrations by kind permission of artists, which I will mention as I go through them. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so first of all, here is the very unassuming first edition cover from 1920 with its suggestive blurb. One of the most remarkable romances published for many years. Beginning in a Hampstead drawing room, it proceeds through a strange, terrific, almost unimaginable world on the confines of visible space and closes on a solemn note in the life after death. Something very, you can hear that, you can hear a particularly ominous voice reading that last bit. Then we have the 1946 edition, which actually points out to the slow burner nature of this novel. And again, I'm reading out the blurb there. This is the reissue of a novel which had little success when published in 1920, was remaindered, began to be talked about, became unprocurable in the secondhand market, and is regarded by some of those who have read it as a work of genius. So again, that sense of picking momentum through the years for a book that was not necessarily as well known to begin with. Then we have this rather abstract 1963 US edition. And again, the blurb here comes from Lauren Aisley, a book which is difficult, if not impossible, to lay down once one has entered the observatory tower where the journey starts and glimpsed the dread blue sun which revolves by far-off torments. This is then the iconic Ballantine edition, first published actually in 1968, but this is the 72 edition, which has the nicer font and the Ballantine unicorn on it. The cover here portrays a favorite scene for illustrators from the novel, and that's Maskell and Ossiaxi, at least that's how I pronounce her name, riding the shroke, an invented flying animal. In the novel, shrokes are described as creatures with long snake-like bodies and 10 reptilian legs apiece, terminating in fins which acted as wings. We will see another version of this scene in a bit. This is the 1980 Sphere edition, again portraying Maskell and Ossiaxi, though I'm not sure why it's calling it a subterranean fantasy classic, but there we are. You can see there that Maskell has grown a tentacle that begins from the area of his heart and breva, through which he can read thoughts. And again, I'll show you another example of that in a minute. Here are the two Canongate editions from 1992 and 1998, respectively. The earlier rather abstractly as alluding to the philosophical themes of the novel, while the latter seems to be portraying Maskell, I presume, whose role in the text becomes sort of Promethean. There's something sort of larger than life about Maskell. And then finally, the 2002 University of Nebraska edition with an introduction by John Clute, who many of you will know, of course, and an afterword by Lauren Aisley. This one, again, tries to capture the idea of the world of torment as a landscape of the mind. We were also very privileged to be given permission to show you some original illustrations by 3 artists, all of which are featuring on our latest blog. So if you go on the Center blog, you can see them there and follow the links to their further work. So this is, again, Maskell and Ossiaxi riding the shroke, and it's by Joel Fletcher. The artist has captured very well Lindsay's vivid description of color here. The shrokes are described as having bodies of bright blue, and the legs and fins were yellow, and they're flying around, you know, in this sort of gracious yet sort of menacing way. So this is Joe Fletcher's. Then I'm moving on to Nicholas J.R.R, who has completed actually a number of illustrations for A Voyage to Arcturus, and the link you can see there points to the entire series. And again, there's a link from our blog. Starkness Observatory, we are told, is somewhere on the northeast coast of Scotland, and that's in chapter 2. And it's from here that Maskell, Knightsbourne Crag set off for Arcturus. So quite an atmospheric representation. And here finally is an illustration picturing the startled Maskell as he awakes from torments and finds out that he has grown fleshly protuberances on his forehead and neck, and perhaps more memorably, as I said before, a breve, which is a tentacle budded from the region of his heart, which is described as long as his arm, but thin like whipcord and soft and flexible. And later on, Joywyn tells him that by means of it, we read one another's thoughts. This illustration is by Monica Burns, a comic artist from Scotland, and was first published in issue 3 of Scottish science fiction magazine, Shoreline of Infinity, and good friends of the Centre. We've worked with them before. So again, just to remind everyone, all these the original illustrations are on the Centre's latest blog post, and you can access them from there. So thank you again to Doug for the covers and to all the artists for allowing us to share the illustrations. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. This is the point where I have to say enough of me for now. It's time for the real thing now. It's time to hear from our 3 guest speakers and panelists. So I will introduce all 3 of them now, and then I'll pass on the baton to our first guest. So first, we will hear from Douglas A. Anderson, Tolkien and Lindsay scholar, and one of a handful of people worldwide who has worked closely with the Lindsay estate and has consulted Lindsay's manuscripts. Doug will be known to many Tolkien fans and scholars as the author of the brilliant annotated Hobbit, which is an indispensable book for teaching and research, and which won the Mythopoeic Award for Inkling's scholarship. but also from his co-edition of with Verling Flieger of Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, in which Tolkien theorizes his practice of writing fantasy. With Verling Flieger and Michael D.C. Drought, he was co-editor of the journal Tolkien Studies over many years, and currently Doug is a reviews editor for the journal, Open Access Journal of Tolkien Research. Doug has edited and written prefaces and introductions on works by Leonard Klein, Kenneth Morris, Evangeline Walden, William Hope Hodgson, and of course, David Lindsay. His books Tales Before Tolkien and Tales Before Narnia are anthologies of influential fantasy and science fiction writing that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis drew upon, and an excellent introduction to tracing the early fantastic. Doug will talk to us about the origins and inspirations of Arcturus, as well as potential interpretations of the novel and its influence on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. All of that in 10 minutes, Doug, right? No pressure. We will then hear from Professor Robert Davies, who is Professor of Religious and Cultural Education here at the University of Glasgow. Bob has published extensively on myth, religion, fantasy, childhood studies, and philosophy, including articles on Alan Garner, Philip Pullman, Robert Graves, the concept of the goddess, Halloween, artificial intelligence of the post-human child, and lots more. And I'm not even getting started on all of his work on Scottish education and the post he's held in national committees and steering groups. I'm sort of sticking with his more sort of speculative fiction output here. Bob is a member of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, and has worked on and co-presented and co-hosted events with us for students working on fantasy, both for our MLit and in the School of Education. Most importantly for today's event, Bob has also corresponded with Philip Pullman about the ways in which Pullman's work echoes aspects of Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, and that will be the main focus of his contribution, including wider spiritual and philosophical dimensions of the novel. And last but most certainly not least, we are very honored to have with us award-winning speculative fiction author Nina Allan. Nina is joining us from Rothesay on the Isle of Bute. Her short stories have appeared in numerous magazines and anthologies, including Dark Horizons, the year's best science fiction, Best Horror of the Year, and the Mammoth Book of Best British Crime. In May 2018, she was named one of the Guardian's Fresh Voices, 50 Writers You Should Read Now, and I agree with that completely. And her short stories and novels have won multiple awards, including the British Science Fiction Award, the Novella Award, the Kitsch's Red Tentacle, and France's Grand Prix de l'Imaginaire. Nina is particularly interested in work that tests the boundaries of genre, playing with philosophical ideas, savoring language, and experimenting with form. Ideas around landscape, sense of place, memory, and personal identity form important strands in her novels and stories. Her recent novel, The Rift, published by Titan Books in 2017, won both the British Science Fiction Association Award and the Red Tentacle Award for Best Novel, and importantly for us, references A Voyage to Arcturus. Nina will talk to us about the way she sees the novel in the contemporary SFF canon and writing practice, and especially on how it is in dialogue with The Rift. So quite amazing people to listen to. So without further ado, let me pass on the baton to Douglas A. Anderson.
Thanks, Dimitra. First, I just wanted to say thanks to the Being Human Festival and the Center for the Fantasy and the Fantastic at University of Glasgow for having us all, gathered together here today on this. And a welcome to all my panelists and the audience. I've been seeing a bunch of names pop up on the little chat button at the bottom with little comments, and it's nice to see a lot of people that I already know and names of people I don't know who I'm familiar with their work. So welcome to everybody. To start, David Lindsay was born in 1876 in Blackheath, a suburb of London. His father was Scottish from a large family in Edinburgh. His mother came from a farming family in Leamington Spa, Warwickshire. Lindsay had two siblings, a brother Alexander, who was 6.5 years older than him, and a sister Margaret, 3 years older. His brother, under the pen name Alexander Crawford, published 6 novels, 4 in book form, some serialized in newspapers, and a handful of short stories in the 1910s before his early death in 1915 at the age of 46. David was educated in London and in Jedburgh, Scotland. He followed his brother at Culf's Grammar School in Lewisham, which he attended from 1885 until December 1890, when David was 14. Around this time, the father simply disappeared and was presumed dead until years later, when it was learned that he had emigrated to Canada and started a new family there. Lindsey was sent to an uncle in Jedburgh and finished his schooling there. Around 1893, he joined a firm of insurance underwriters in London and read voraciously and worked his way up in positions over the next 20-odd years. During these decades, he read voraciously novels as well as philosophers, including Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, which are apparent in Arcturus, and he planned someday to turn to literature. Meanwhile, he kept notebooks of his observations and personal philosophy. In a literary club, after the outbreak of World War I, he met Jacqueline Silver, and they were married in December 1916. Lindsey was 40 and Jacqueline 18. They would have 2 daughters. Lindsey did war service in London with the Grenadier Guards. In 1919, Lindsey and his wife settled in Cornwall. A decade later, they would move to Faring near Worthing in West Sussex, and after another 10 years, finally to Hove. In Cornwall, Lindsey began his first novel in April 1919. It was finished by March the following year, when it was accepted for publication by the very first publisher to whom Lindsey submitted it, Methuen of London. Then titled Night Spore in Tort Prism, Methuen insisted on 2 provisions. 1, the manuscript be cut by 15,000 words, and 2, the work be retitled A Voyage to Arcturus. Lindsey complied, rewriting the book and changing the name of Tort Prism to Torments. The original manuscript does not survive, though he regretted the change of title, which removed Nightspore as a character from the reader's active attention. The book was published on the 16th of September, 1920. Methuen printed 2,500 folded and gathered sheets, but initially bound up only 1,000 copies. The book sold poorly. 1,000 further sets of sheets were scrapped as waste paper, and the book was remaindered a few years later. The first edition sold only 596 copies at full price, but the whole bound run of 1,500 copies did in fact sell out. One of the first reviews appeared in the Times Literary Supplement on the 30th of September, 1920. It was not favorable, and I wish I could read the whole of it here for its complete obtuseness. Clearly, the anonymous critic, which later research has revealed to be Adelaide Champneys, daughter of the famous architect Basil Champneys, was a poor choice as a reviewer. She noted that Lindsey captures the elusive quality of the worst kind of nightmare, that the plot appears to be a riot of morbid fancy, that the book is, quote, consistent in respect of its uniform unwholesomeness, unquote. Review ends, it is no doubt a legitimate aim of the writer of fiction to make the flesh creep, scarcely, we think, to make the gorge rise. From that point on, Lindsey's writing career was increasingly troubled. He published only 4 more novels before his death in 1945 at the age of 69. The Haunted Woman was serialized in a London newspaper, the Daily News, in 1921 and came out in book form in 1922. Sphinx came out in 1923. The Adventures of Monsieur de Mailly in 1926, and Devil's Tour in 1932. His total output was small: 7 novels, 2 unpublished at his death, 1 57-page typescript of sketch notes for a new system of philosophy based on his discarded notebooks, and a fairy play written for his daughters one Christmas time in the mid-1930s. I was very pleased that Lindsey's daughters allowed me to publish for the first time the Christmas play in my 2003 anthology, Tales Before Tolkien. The common key to all of Lindsey's writings is found in his sketch notes and exemplified in Arcturus. It is that our visible primary world is a sham, and that the real world of the spirit lies underneath this sham, occasionally visible or recognized. The pain motif in Arcturus is often misunderstood. Pain to Lindsey was a phenomenon of this sham world, one which reminds us of the existence of the real world underneath. After Arcturus, all of Lindsey's novels are earthbound. The Haunted Woman is a kind of metaphysical thriller of the type soon afterwards to be written by Charles Williams. Sphinx tells of a man who invents a machine to record dreams and thus accesses the real world via the dreams. Devil's Tour, set in Dartmoor, concerns the worship of the mother goddess and an associated talisman that was anciently broken in halves but will be rejoined in modern times for the betterment of all humanity. The Adventures of Monsieur de Mailly, a historical adventure novel of early 18th century France under Louis XIV, is often derided as a potboiler, despite Lindsay's own assertion that it was not one. Oddly, it was the only novel by Lindsay to achieve an American edition, where it was retitled A Blade for Sale, during Lindsay's lifetime. Lindsay never lost faith in Arcturus. In 1932, when Devil's Tour was about to come out, he reclaimed the publishing rights to Arcturus from Methuen, though he was unable to get another publisher to reissue it. Finally, Victor Gollancz reissued it in 1946, the year after Lindsay's death. Gollancz, as a fledgling publisher, had met Lindsay in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and he admired Arcturus, but did not then dare to republish the book. Gradually, Arcturus picked up admirers. One of the first, in 1925, was L.H. Myers, the novelist and fringe Bloomsbury member. Lindsay and Myers became friends, and Myers's multi-volumed novel, The Near and the Far, was clearly influenced by Lindsay's Arcturus. In the early 1930s, Myers got science fiction writer Olaf Stapleton to read Arcturus, and at the same time, he got Lindsay to read Stapleton's newly published Last and First Men. Desmond McCarthy called Arcturus a great experience, and J.B. Priestley said it was a grand piece of wild imagining. In early 1937, C.S. Lewis read the book, which his friend Arthur Greeves had highly recommended to him, and Lewis shared it immediately with J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien wrote of Arcturus in 1938, "I read A Voyage to Arcturus with avidity. No one could read it merely as a thriller and without interest in philosophy, religion, and morals." Lewis called Arcturus, well, that shattering, intolerable, and irresistible work, unquote, and basically stole the plot for the first two of his Ransom cycle, Out of the Silent Planet, published in 1938, and Perelandra, 1943. In a letter from 1947, Lewis noted that, quote, "From Lindsay, I first learned what other planets in fiction are really good for spiritual adventures," unquote. Lewis championed Arcturus until his death in 1963. Tolkien cited Arcturus in his unfinished The Notion Club papers, published posthumously in 1992. At Tolkien's death in 1973, 3 copies of Arcturus were found in his library: a secondhand copy of the first edition of 1920, and the Gollancz reprints of 1946 and 1963. Interest in Lindsay really picked up after the 1956 BBC third program radio dramatization of Arcturus. In 1963, Arcturus finally appeared in an American edition, published in a line of Macmillan Classics of Science Fiction. Sadly, the text was line edited by a copy editor who not only changed punctuation throughout the book, but also words and phrases. This edition was introduced by the naturalist Lauren Isley, an odd choice, but the editor of the series, Kenneth Hoyer, wrote me that he'd first approached others to do the introduction. Bertrand Russell turned him down, saying he didn't like the book. T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, Hoyer thought, also turned him down. The corrupted text appeared in the Ballantine paperback with cover art by Bob Pepper. It appeared in 1968 and went through several printings in the US and the UK. By this point, the book had really caught on. In 1970, William Holloway made a student film of the novel, over 70 minutes long, at Antioch College in Ohio. For a few years, it had some national distribution in the US, and then it disappeared for decades, until 2003, when Holloway restored it and released it on DVD. After Holloway's death in 2014, his sons put the film up on YouTube, which is where I believe it still is. In 1976, Lindsay's unpublished novel, The Violet Apple, appeared, along with a severely edited portion of his final novel, The Witch. Violet Apple concerns the planting of 2 ancient seeds purported to be from the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, from which a stunted apple tree grows that gives forth 2 small violet apples, the eating of which brings about a metaphysical raising of consciousness. The Witch is a remarkable dream vision of a man being allowed to pass through the 3 musics of death while still living, and thus able to report on the experiences to his fellow mankind. In 1979, critic Harold Bloom published the only novel of his long career, The Flight to Lucifer, which Bob showed us a bit ago, subtitled A Gnostic Fantasy, which is a turgid reworking of Arcturus, which Bloom would champion in his chapter on fantasy in his 1982 critical work, Agon. Afterwards, Bloom would never let The Flight to Lucifer be reprinted, but other authors would be inspired by Arcturus too. In 1983, Paul Corfield Godfrey wrote the score for an opera based on Arcturus, performed in Cardiff. In 1985, another opera of Arcturus was performed in Los Angeles. Many artists and musicians have also been inspired by Arcturus. You'll have already seen some of the artwork that appeared on various covers of the book in Dimitra's introduction. Of musicians, there are relevant works by Ron Thomas, Daniel Kaniga, Henry Kaiser, and Vacula. Just last year in Australia, there was Phil Moore's self-titled or self-described heavy metal steampunk sci-fi musical of Arcturus, which you can find online on a website with, I think it's arcturusthemusical.com or something like that. On a Google search should turn it up. The publisher, Victor Gollancz, met Lindsay only a couple of times, but he left a memoir, a brief memoir of him. Gollancz wrote, "He struck me as a person of singular charm and gentleness, not at all what one would expect from the pain motif of Arcturus. I remember only two things about him. The first is that he seemed to me far more a Beethovenian than of a writer. The second is that he made a remark which, on the face of it, was the most outrageously arrogant I have ever heard given, and yet was, in fact, the expression of a profound humility. Lindsay said, 'Only a very few people will ever read Arcturus, but as long as even 2 or 3 people will listen to Beethoven, 2 or 3 people will read it.' A Voyage to Arcturus is now 100 years old. It is hailed as a classic of Scottish literature and of fantasy and science fiction literature. Lindsay's audience has now far surpassed the 2 or 3 people he once foresaw." Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Doug. I've said that in every online live event, but you know, this is the point where we would have had the applause, but we can't do this at the moment, but I can see lots and lots of reaction from the audience. Okay, Bob, you're up next.
Thank you, everyone. You may excuse my voice, which is still in COVID recovery mode, but I've well lubricated it in a toast to our honoured guest this evening. I intend to do 2 things here, quite simple things really. I wish to take further a point that Doug has already made about I suppose the theology or the anti-theology of Arcturus. And then I wish to show and invite reflection upon the influence it has had on one very important contemporary writer, no doubt valued by everyone here, Philip Pullman and his Dark Materials trilogy. But I want to begin just with a 1-minute personal memory. I read Arcturus when I was 17, picking up that 1968 book from a pile of books in the office of my then first-year university tutor, a tousle-haired and mercurial young man called Douglas Gifford. And he saw me looking at this book, asked me if I liked science fiction. I sheepishly admitted yes. That was not actually very much the done thing in wolf to wolf English literature courses in those days. He moved to hand it to me and he said, "Bobby, you're a Catholic, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, yes." He went, "Oh, good, you'll be safe. I'm a Protestant. I never feel safe around that book." And that kind of set me on a journey. I read the book, and a bit like the readings that many people have reported, particularly Harold Bloom, I read the book over and over till it kind of fell apart in my hands. I kept returning to it obsessively, even as I became enculturated as an orthodox student of English literature. and decided that that's really where my vocation lay. Then I suppose I rediscovered it again as a graduate student of religion, with one of these kind of OMG moments when I was studying, to my great exhilaration, Gnosticism. Now, I've got something to say about Gnosticism in a moment or two in a more kind of scholarly way, self-quoting shamelessly from something I've written. But I want just to wrestle with a puzzle or pose a puzzle. How could Gnosticism have influenced even so erudite and so self-taught a man, autodidactically taught as Lindsay, since until 1945, the only references we possessed to Gnosticism were the citations of its patristic opponents, its enemies among the early church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd century. Now, these were often glitteringly attractive quotations and citations of Gnostic scriptures and Gnostic authorities, and certainly have proved enormously attractive down the centuries to a tradition of writers, most especially European and English romantics. There are Kathleen Raine documented searching Gnostic influences on William Blake. I've argued very passionately that Shelley, who is in fact a greater influence on Philip Pullman in my view than Blake is, Shelley too was seduced by a kind of Gnosticism that he realised was also extremely bad for him. But then history furnishes us with one of these great miracles, because in 1945, the Nag Hammadi Library in Alexandria in Egypt was discovered. A collection of Coptic manuscripts from the 2nd century that are in effect an almost complete Gnostic library. Certainly an almost complete Gnostic library of the Valentinian school, the one that has proved to be the most philosophically sophisticated and the most influential, including upon Philip Pullman, who's written very interestingly about Valentinus himself. There have been occasions when I've spoken about Pullman, Lindsay, Gnosticism, and at the end, some people wait behind almost as if I've got a Gnostic church application form in my bag that I can supply them with. Before I self-quote here, I am not a Gnostic. And I don't have any application forms, but I am fascinated by it, and I encourage you, in the spirit of literary criticism, to read it and see if you also discern what I discern in Arcturus and Philip Pullman joining me in that perception. So here's my kind of summary of Gnosticism: confused, fragmentary, sometimes impenetrable, and for the Romantics at least, communicated exclusively in the citations of its patristic opponents, Gnostic theology begins its wholesale revision of Judeo-Christian orthodoxy by an astonishing declaration that the God of the Old Testament is a demonic impostor. Deliberately malevolent or merely blind and blundering, Yahweh's dominion, the Gnostics claim, is arbitrary and illegitimate. His disastrous act of creation is a work of envy or malicious imitation, its very existence constituting the fall from an original state of perfection and forever trapping sparks of the primordial divine pneuma in the corrupt fabric of matter, including the botched handiwork that is the human form. All but entirely eclipsed by the shadow of this insane demiurge, there endures, remote and unrecognized, a pristine concentration of being, in the depths of which the Gnostic crisis mysteriously originated. From this almost unimaginable source derive the precious filaments of pneuma, now manifest in the multitude of human souls toiling within the material cosmos in a state of alienation and amnesia. Their liberation from this sorry condition is to be attained not through any pointless act of faith or submission to the counterfeit deity, but by the individual accession of a divine gnosis or knowledge, which represents the exiled soul's climactic recognition of its true identity and the nature of the fallen creation in which it is imprisoned. Well, this is steampunk theology, right enough. Platonism, Neoplatonism on steroids. Of course, it is important to distinguish it from the orthodox Platonic schools. Plato, of course, describes the demiurge, but the demiurge's imitation of the forms in Platonic and later Neoplatonic thought is an act of love. This is not the case in this world of crystalman in which we are trapped, and where the glimpse of muspel, of dust, one might say, that we are occasionally granted or periodically access serve only to underline our exile and alienation, if also occasionally to prompt us to shake off the falsehoods in which we are incarcerated and find the true ground of being with the true creator and deity of the acosmic reality from which we are cut off. My perception that Arcturus is in some sense a Gnostic romance. Remember, Harold Bloom says tormance is a kind of blend of torment and romance. His quester, Lindsay's questers, voyage north like so many questers of the European romantic imagination. But my sense that the book is imprinted with these philosophical and theological, what would I say, obsessions, is not invalidated by the absence of the corpus of Gnostic scriptures that we now have access to today. Because if my perception is correct, then these are perennial themes, and I think Doug was hinting at this also. These are perennial themes that have surfaced in thinkers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, maybe not always named as part of the Gnostic lexicon, but perhaps telling us that there is something enduring in this conviction that the world as we experience it is not our home, and indeed maybe our prison house. Transitioning to Philip Pullman, a very strange thing happened. I'm not nearly as systematic a reader of fantasy literature or children's literature as many people in this gathering this evening, but I was drawn to his dark materials by its obviously religious associations and reverberations. I was, and I've told Philip this, so I am not defaming him here, I was and remain absolutely convinced that his dark materials is a deeply anti-Christian work. It belongs to the same Protestant imaginary as Milton, as Shelley, as Blake, this abhorrence of the Latin tradition as a vehicle of religious revelation and regulation, this demonization of Rome and the magisterium. I see it all being realized in the small screen at the moment every Sunday evening. My convictions further underlined. When I finished reading the trilogy, just as really as the third volume came out, I thought, this is a real puzzle. This is extraordinary. It feels so resonant with Lindsay and themes and even personalities. By a circuitous route through Marina Warner, I found a way of contacting Philip Pullman directly. I've written to authors before. They're busy people, often disappears into the authorial void. The day after he received my letter, this document appeared. You can see it on my fax machine. I then had a fax machine in this room, and it started to buzz, and suddenly this document was pumped out of it, with Philip Pullman impatiently telling me that he had set aside a morning to reply to me and to respond to my faint suggestion that he might have read and been influenced by A Voyage to Arcturus, and specifically, which was my query, its Gnostic rebellion against the authority. So I want to conclude with one, I think, very pregnant quotation from this letter, which I quote with permission, let me say, and I have quoted other parts in print. This is what Pullman has to say. What no one, including Harold Bloom, has managed to deal with is the Gnostic hatred of the physical world. I do think I've got an original spin on that. My myth, for want of a better word, is Gnostic to the degree that it tells of a secret and hidden truth contradicting the official doctrines of the church, but passionately anti-Gnostic in that it celebrates the materiality of the universe. Matter loves matter. That's the basis of it. Because of its amorous nature, matter delights to join with itself to form complex structures. Dust is a picture of what happens when it becomes conscious of itself. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, of course, embodied the principle known as the Sophia, which Gnosticism traditionally agrees is to blame for everything. In the amber spyglass, that principle becomes embodied without her realizing it in Mary Malone. I realize that by talking about principles becoming embodied, I am flirting with Platonism, which normally I despise. But it feels like that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was absolutely wonderful, and a heroic sort of contribution tonight. You know, being in recovery from COVID and sharing all of this knowledge and you know the Philip Pullman quotation with us. Thank you so much. Okay, and we're moving out to our third speaker. I'm passing on the baton to Nina Allan.
Hi, Dimitra.
Hello there.
Thanks, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. I think I've been chosen as the token novelist and devil's advocate. I've been looking at Arcturus.
Nina, sorry to interrupt you. Just a second. I don't think we can see you at the moment.
I haven't changed anything on my screen at all.
Okay.
I've just been sitting here, so I don't know.
Yeah. Do you want to just hide your screen and open it again, just in case that fixes it?
Oops.
So stop. If you do stop video at the that's it. We've got you now. We've got you. Okay. Right. I'm hiding now. Thanks.
That's fine. Sorry. It's probably better that way. No, I'm fascinated. I'm absolutely fascinated by this book. I think my approach to it is slightly at right angles to Bob and Doug, in that I've been looking at it primarily as a text, as a novel, how it works as a novel. And I've got a few personal reflections about my first reading and my more recent reading. And it's been a really interesting voyage for me. So here we go. My relationship with A Voyage to Arcturus is a strange one. I first read the novel more than 30 years ago, sometime during the period of my mid to late teens, when I was hoovering up science fiction, more or less indiscriminately. My memories of it from that time are indistinct. I remember a wandering, quest-like narrative, rather in the manner of Jules Verne and his journey to the center of the earth, which was one of the first science fiction novels I ever read. Only it was much weirder. I knew nothing about the book's author, David Lindsay. I had no idea he was Scottish. I hadn't realized how much earlier Arcturus was written than some of the other novels of the fantastic I was reading at the time. Something of the book's poetry and mystery must have stayed with me, however, because when I came to write my novel, The Rift, I knew at once and almost subconsciously that one of the key sections would carry Lindsay's title. The Rift tells the story of two sisters, Selina and Julie. Sorry, I'm just wondering if I can light this better. I know you can't see anything. The Rift tells the story of two sisters, Selina and Julie, who were reunited after a separation of 20 years, during which time Julie claims to have been living on an alien planet called Tristane. Of course, not everyone believes Julie. Even her sister is uncertain of whether her account can be trusted. And I think it was this sense of ambiguity around what had happened to Julie that made me remember Arcturus. I was attracted by the poetic synchronicity between my novel and Lindsay's, the lack of closure around what really happens. Did the voyage take place or not? Was it all in the mind? Also, I loved the title, just the feel of the words, the chilly elegance of them. I don't think it's any accident that when Julie first arrives on Tristane, she finds herself in a cold place. The word Arcturus was resonating with me even then. What a surprise to me then when I discovered that A Voyage to Arcturus was not the book's original title. Lindsay's working title for his manuscript, some 10 years and more in the writing, was Nightspore in Tormance. His publishers were afraid that sounded too obscure and so encouraged him to change it. A Voyage to Arcturus was first published in 1920, the same year Isaac Asimov was born, a fact that helps us to remember perhaps just how new science fiction still was as a genre, how original and shockingly outlandish A Voyage to Arcturus must have seemed to readers at the time. Rereading the novel some 3 decades after first encountering it, I was immediately struck by how closely Arcturus chimes with the fantastic literature of the age, yet also stands apart from it. Lindsay was known to have read and admired writers like Jules Verne and Rider Haggard, as well as his fellow Scots, Robert Louis Stevenson and Walter Scott, and their influence is clear. A Voyage to Arcturus is an adventure narrative like no other. Its protagonist, Maskell, states from the outset that he is in search of adventure, and it's not hard to find within the narrative echoes of novels such as Ivanhoe, Kidnapped, King Solomon's Mines, and Journey to the Center of the Earth. But that is where meaningful comparison ends. Although A Voyage to Arcturus might usefully be grouped with science fiction's early essays in scientific romance, the novels of H.G. Wells being the most obvious example, it's not really like them. Where Wells and Verne style their novels as genuine attempts to imagine or to extrapolate how human society might develop, what wonders and dangers humanity might encounter in exploring the cosmos, the unsolved riddle of our own Earth even. What Lindsay attempts in A Voyage to Arcturus might be claimed as one of science fiction's earliest voyages into inner space. More even than Wells, I find it interesting to compare Lindsay's work with Alexei Tolstoy's 1923 novel Aelita, the first full-length work of Russian science fiction, and as important to Russians as H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds is to us Brits. In Aelita, a maverick engineer who has constructed a spacecraft to take him to Mars advertises for a resourceful and brave traveling companion to accompany him on his journey. His eventual comrade, Gusiev, is a Bolshevik soldier who's finding it hard to readjust to civilian life in the wake of his experience fighting in the Russian Civil War. The metal sphere in which they make their fantastical journey is not at all unlike the crystal torpedo used by Krag, Knightspor and Maskell in their own Voyage to Arcturus. But whereas Tolstoy uses his scientific romance to further illuminate and explore the harsh ideological landscape of revolutionary Russia, David Lindsay once again is doing something rather different. As Alexei Tolstoy's experiences in the Russian Civil War strongly influenced the writing of Aelita, A Voyage to Arcturus bears the marks and background of World War I. If Arcturus could be said to have a central message, it could perhaps best be summed up as what makes human existence meaningful, and how do we bear the existential nihilism of a world in which death and suffering are all around. In matters of style and formal approach, there are useful comparisons to be made between the work of David Lindsay and H.P. Lovecraft. But whereas Lovecraft is obsessed with the terminal nature of everything, the inescapable madness of the howling void, the vision Lindsay offers up is more transcendent than nihilistic. Death comes to us all, but in feeling ourselves at one with the universe, in surrendering our selfish desires, we can burst through to a world of the spirit that represents our true and better selves. For me, the most successful aspect of A Voyage to Arcturus is in Lindsay's landscape writing. His visions of an alien planet are incandescent, wildly strange, and often inspiringly beautiful. The breadth and depth of imagination on display in his descriptions of the terrain, flora and fauna of Tormance, not to mention its people, might also persuade the reader that Lindsay is describing his own dreams. There's an operatic grandeur to Lindsay's vision, and I wasn't entirely surprised to discover that the composer and pianist John Ogden had written a large-scale operatic composition based on Arcturus, bringing excerpts from the text into consort with passages from the Gospels. Ogden, like others, clearly saw Arcturus as a religious work somewhat akin to John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress, with Maskell in the role of Christian. Equally fascinating is the new musical adaptation of this impossible novel. You can actually see, I think as Bob said, you can see a segment of it on YouTube, and I've watched it. It's Australian creator and director Phil Moore. He says he was actively drawn to Arcturus because of its philosophical underpinning and because it was a real drama, as he put it, as opposed to satire or comedy in the manner of science fiction musicals of the past, like The Little Shop of Horrors or Rocky Horror Picture Show. He cleverly cast Maskell as a young, attractive, sensitive man, as opposed to the pedantic, sexist, and peculiarly priggish character we meet in the novel. For this is where we must ask ourselves how successful exactly Lindsay is in his ambition. The cult writer and alternative thinker Colin Wilson was a famous admirer of A Voyage to Arcturus. He called it a masterpiece of the 20th century. But devotee though he was, he found his patience increasingly tested by what he saw as the stodginess of Lindsay's style. And here we quote from Wilson: "The man was a towering genius whose mind is cast in the same mould as that of Dostoevsky, but ordinary technical ability, the literary talent that so many third-rate novelists possess in abundance, was denied to him." Harsh words. As a one-time Russian scholar with a particular interest in Dostoevsky, I found this quote from Wilson enlightening because it's not far wrong. Lindsay's total commitment to and pursuit of an idea, not to say an ideal, is vividly apparent throughout Arcturus. Though his approach is radically different, Lindsay seems to be fired with the same epistemological zeal as the great Russian, and his work likewise offers a vast and tantalizing array of possible meanings and interpretations. Dostoevsky, though, could write character and did so with passion, as anyone acquainted with Rodion Raskolnikov or Ivan Karamazov would surely attest. As a novel of character, A Voyage to Arcturus is an embarrassing failure in which the demands of a simplistic quest narrative are the entire determinant of character action. For me, it's not so much the style of Lindsay's writing that is at fault. Lindsay was possessed of a vivid and singular imagination, so much as its peculiar turn of priggishness and rampant sexism. It's interesting to note, by the way, that if you visit the website, The Violet Apple, which is devoted to Lindsay and contains a wealth of fascinating material, interviews, archive, anyone interested should go there. But it's interesting to note that every single critic quoted, every single person discussing it, they're all blokes. They're just blokes talking to each other. I found this really interesting. And all the writers too that are strongly influenced, they're blokes. Lindsay does make some startlingly modern observations about gender and sexuality, even going so far as to invent a set of non-binary pronouns for one character as he gropes towards a broader understanding of gender and sexuality, engaging with these issues in a way that prefigures writing by Ursula Le Guin or John Varley some 50 years later. However, there's nothing to explain or excuse the all-round direness of his attitude towards women. So we have Joywind, the angelic helpmeet, Oshax, the temptress, Tudomin, the jealous harpy, and Sullenboda, who is, and I quote, not a woman, but a mass of pure sex. Your passion will draw her out into human shape, but only for a moment. If the change were permanent, you would have endowed her with a soul. Woman with a soul, curious conceit. Lindsay has read Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and boy, it shows. D.H. Lawrence can get away with a lot when it comes to being a patronizing sexist because he's one hell of a writer. In A Voyage to Arcturus, Lindsay's prejudices are embarrassingly on full display. Having reread the novel, I'd have to frame its relationship to my own novel as ironical. In The Rift, Selina is faced with the choice of believing her sister and cutting herself adrift from her conventional worldview, or clinging to what logic tells her must be the truth and dismissing Julie's experience as post-traumatic madness. I find a renewed satisfaction in the fact that these philosophical arguments are conducted between women. Men here are strictly an optional extra. As we turn the final page of Arcturus, we find ourselves faced as readers with a similar dilemma. Did any of it happen, or are we back where we started, on the northeast coast of Scotland on a stormy night, wondering why we came here and where we are going? A Voyage to Arcturus is a singular, frustrating, baffling, but ultimately rewarding book. Rewarding precisely because of its obscurity, because of its own inner confusion, its refusal to be typecast. It is possibly unique in science fiction and shines a revelatory light on science fiction's early development. Once you read it, you may not like it, but you'll never forget it. And I, for one, will be queuing up to see the musical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was wonderful. And you opened up all sorts of issues that are already coming up in the questions. So it's all chiming quite nicely. I think we're up for a good discussion. Thanks to Doug and Bob as well. And can we have you back on camera, please? And unmuted, Doug and Bob as well, because I'm going to start with the questions now. And there's already quite a few. Okay, so I'm going to go all the way to the beginning and try and trace. Just to remind everyone that I cannot monitor any questions or comments on the chat box. So if you want a question read to our participants and answered, please put it in the Q&A, not the chat box, okay? Okay, so the first question is by Brenton Dickinson, who's a good colleague and recently, got his doctorate on C.S. Lewis. He's asking, my curiosity for the esteemed panelists is about C.S. Lewis's comment on the quality of the literature of Arcturus. He loved the book, it changed his life and all of fantasy literature after him, but he said it had a rather abominable style. I would love to know if panelists agree. Brendan's view is he sort of does agree with that. I'm not sure about the life-changing either. So the style, the actual sort of language, the actual technique. Shall we go to Doug first?
Yes, please. Am I?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
You're back.
Oh,
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I did want to say something about Lindsay's style, because style is one of those horrible linguistic terms that mean different things at different times. Now, Lindsay was when his books were published, nobody complained about the style. And it wasn't until after his death and into the 50s, and then it was actually Victor Gollancz who started the sort of idea of Lindsay as a bad writer. He should have been a musician instead. And Colin Wilson rather extended it by going to some of the lengths as Nina quoted. I'd like to unpack that a little bit because of at least two ways. Lindsay and his attitudes towards women. Lindsay was Victorian, and he didn't start writing until his 40s. So, and Arcturus is the first novel. So I think that doesn't forgive some of his mistakes, but I think it helps to explain some of them. Even in a letter written the year after Arcturus was published, Lindsay wrote that he realized it was written in a rather unpopular style. And I think part of what Lindsay meant by that is Lindsay didn't care at all for the stylish decoration or building up of horror of Lovecraft, or the clear conversational style of Colin Wilson. He cared about the ideas. And in his sketch notes, he says one thing about the only important thing about style is to write in a way that the idea will be remembered. And I think when you look at that through his other books, he was capable of doing different stylish things, but for one reason or another, he chose not to. And some of the other aspects of style that are problematic, I think, are his social views, because being Victorian and brought up under Victorian, he had certain social mores that by the 1920s were quite outdated. In The Violet Apple, for example, it takes him a chapter and a half to maneuver an unmarried man and woman to be alone in a room to talk. That's embarrassing to modern readers. So, and I don't wish to defend Lindsay on aspects of that, but we have to take it for what is there and what is written. Nina also had some interesting things to say about his readership, or Lindsay, what Lindsay read, and Dostoevsky and the Russians were among his favorite writers. So, I think if you try some of the later books, the styles are very different. Gary Wolfe, the critic, has written on Devil's Tour and said it reads like a translation by Thomas Carlyle of Immanuel Kant. And I don't think, though that sounds rude, I don't think it's inaccurate. And J.B. Pick then extended it by saying that passages of The Witch, Gary Wolfe said it read like a Henry James translation of Kant. John Pick said that The Witch reads like a Thomas Carlyle translation of some of the most elusive speculations of Plotinus. And again, that sounds rude up front, but it's not entirely unfair. But on the other hand, when you read Lindsay's fairy play, you see a distinct playfulness with language and a complete knowledge of he knows exactly what he's doing. Whether one agrees with what he attempted in his style of trying to keep the idea in the front and to avoid cliched turns of phrase at any cost works, that's another question. So I'll let somebody else take up on that.
Nina or Bob, would you like to chip in to this question?
It's really interesting to compare him with other science fiction writers of the same time, to compare him with Wells, to compare him with Verne. And I did really find this curious a likeness to the Russian, to Aelita, to the Alexei Tolstoy. It's not, it's just really fascinating to see the kinds of ideas that were being embodied and framed by these very early speculative writers. So I don't know. Wells's novels are much more successful in the round as novels. There is absolutely no, and that's what, sort of like if you take a novel like The Time Machine or War of the Worlds, you can see, the relative skill in actually driving a novel's plot forward is there in Wells in a way that I cannot comment on other works by Lindsay because I've only read Arcturus. But in Arcturus, it's almost like opera seria. It's this sequential series of tableau almost, which I keep coming to musical analogies all the time. The whole thing really reminded me of Parsifal. The Wagner opera. I had a whole section in my talk about that. It just overran though, and I couldn't deliver it. But it's in the end, as I say, sort of love it, hate it, or be bemused by it. It's a book that you've just got to engage with somehow because it's just so out there. It's like,
thank you, Nina. Bob, was that a hand there flying? Or?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I think the question's been answered quite comprehensively, but I would simply, and I warmed to, as a Wagnerian, I warmed to the Parsifal comparisons. Remember, I read recently, Lee Bardugo talking about the Grishaverse books and how she feels one of her tasks in that series is to kind of undo the entrenched sexism of the fantasy genre, which she feels has kind of haunted her love of this genre all through her life as a reader and as a writer. And I went back recently to one of the Michael Moorcock Elric books when I was sick, and I was completely absorbed and I was dreaming about it. But boy, some of the writing is terrible, really, really terrible. More lit crit kind of answer. I looked just a few days ago after reading Kate Summerscale's book about the haunting of Alma Fielding, about the sales cults of the post-war periods, exactly the same period, of course, as the production of Arcturus, the publishing of Arcturus. Several writers have criticised that opening seance scene for being mannered, stilted, contrived. But actually, that's what these seances were like. They were. Everybody who attended a seance had a kind of speaking part, and I actually felt he got close to the performative aspects of a seance, even in writing that did grate against one's sympathies in places.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move swiftly to there are two questions that sort of overlap, so I'll ask them together. One is from Sean Martin, and there is a sort of a response and a further question by Andy Sawyer, who's also on our chat. And they're asking about whether Meyer's letters to Lindsay and Stapleton survive, maybe in the University of Liverpool. And then Andy Sawyer, very, very helpfully from the University of Liverpool, responds that he doesn't remember letters from Lindsay in the Stapleton archive, but he's asking specifically, Doug, what did Lindsay think of Stapleton Last and First Men, for example? Do we have any evidence?
That is a very frustrating question. Andy actually helped me with the Stapleton archive 20 years ago or so, and other places. Myers unfortunately asked all of his correspondents to destroy all his letters before he killed himself in 1944. And many of them did, but I think Stapleton kept some, and there are a few odd ones here and there at different archives in that. The frustrating answer is that there's a letter from Myers to Lindsey, where Myers wrote to Lindsey sometime in 1930, late 1930, I think it was. He said, I have in one hand David Lindsay, your own comments on Olaf Stapleton's book. I have in my other hand Olaf Stapleton's comments on your book. And he leaves it there, says nothing more. And as far as I know, those comments do not survive anywhere. Stapleton started around 1937. He would give a lecture on science and fiction and literature. And in his notes, he has in big capital letters, Lindsey, Arcturus. And he clearly said something about it, but he never wrote out that lecture. So we don't know what he would have said there either. So it's a frustrating scholarly dead end, at least in my experience.
Thanks for that. That was pretty clear then. Okay. David Bratman, current editor of Tolkien Studies, is also here in our chat, and he's asking, why do you think that, Doug, why do you think that C.S. Lewis never, so far as we know, wrote a fan letter to Lindsey? He had a habit of writing to living authors like Charles Williams, E.R. Edison, T.H. White, Mervyn Peake, but not Lindsey. Do we know?
That's a complicated question, because when Lewis discovered it, it would have been early 37. If, as Lewis did when he found an author that he seems to have liked, he would reach out to the author or look for another book by them. We know he read The Nightland and wrote interesting things about that, though he found problems with it, of course. That's William Hope Hodgson's The Nightland. Well, apparently he also went out and grabbed another Hodgson book, which is in his library now in the Wade Center in Wheaton College, Illinois, The Luck of the Strong, which is probably Hodgson's worst book. It's commercial sea stories. So if he went from there to read The Luck of the Strong, he got the wrong book, because he would have loved House on the Borderland, which is probably Hodgson's greatest achievement in fantasy and literature. Similarly, if in 1937, Lewis went to find another book by Lindsey, Devil's Tour had come out in 1932, and the publisher framed the blurbs to imply that it was Lindsey's only novel since Arcturus, which came out a dozen years earlier, which is a very odd thing that, but if anyone looking at that would not think to look for any of the other books. So if, for example, he looked at Devil's Tour and found it was a 500-page tome in small type, and even if he tried to read it, the plot of it takes place over a
few days, really.
4 days, though with a gap of almost a day in the middle there somewhere. But there's one series of 2 chapters which, take place interiorly of the characters' minds in a room in a gap of about 20 seconds. And it's 20-some pages worth. So anyone seeing that would see an entirely different book from Arcturus, whether they wanted to read it or not. And that might have put Lewis off. There are hints that Verlyn Flieger has written. She thinks Tolkien had read Devil's Tour because of the meteorite implications in it, and how Tolkien then used that in the Notion Club papers. It was. The other example is I think that perhaps Lewis didn't think Lindsey's message would engage in friendship with him.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why he didn't write him. But we know he wrote Edison. We know he wrote and invited in 1946 or 7, I think it was. He wrote and invited T.H. White to come to an Inklings, who turned them down.
There we go. Thank you for that, Doug. That's great. I've got a question for Bob and one for Nina, I think would be the best one to answer first, both from Christine Ferguson from the University of Stirling, who's with us tonight. So Bob, Christine says, can you help me better understand the distinction, or if there is one, between Lindsay's Gnosticism and Schopenhauer's pessimism? It's a bit of a big philosophical question there for you, Bob. What do you think?
Well, I suppose a fundamental distinction for me would be, and I think this comes through in Arcturus, there's no will in Lindsay. And this is part of the kind of fatalism, interrupted fatalism, perhaps, of Lindsay and Arcturus. The glimpses of Muspel, the apprehension, spasmodic and possibly illusory of Soter, but accord no agency to the protagonists. Indeed, there's much to be discussed here in the relationship between Maskell and Nightsport. I see the Gnostic vision, which certainly influenced Schopenhauer, although Schopenhauer's also is influenced by movements like Buddhism and so on, into seeing how renunciation can bring liberation. I see the fatalism as a much more entrenched and almost irresolvable one in Arcturus, accounting for that aporetic ending, where I see nothing in the way of even the Wagnerian, Parsifalian hope that there might be for suffering, redemption through suffering in that Schopenhauerian philosophical resignation. It's even more fatalistic for me.
Thanks for that, Bob. Goodness, yes, that does sound pretty grim, doesn't it? And the second question by Christine is, what are the panelists' views on gender switches? And that's something that Nina briefly touched upon, that occur in Tormans in characters such as Panawa and Crim Typhon. And how do these transformations fit within this Gnostic contempt for embodiment? So first, there's two sides to this question. First of all, how do we engage with that? And then does that fit with a more philosophical, spiritual view here? Nina, would you like to go first on that?
I can say something sort of quite general about it. I think it's the aspect of the novel that surprised me most, because he really did seem to be grasping towards what are very modern ideas and embody, as I say, that there's this whole section where he's got non-binary pronouns. I don't know at all if he's the first person to have done that in science fiction, but he must have been one of the earliest. That's really fascinating, and it's bizarre because it's so at odds with the way he actually does write women. He's actually sort of more like liberal at this idea of expanding gender into a non-binary. When he actually comes to write about women, I found the background fascinating. Again, I don't know huge amounts about it. But it seemed as though his brother Alex was a much more shall we say, rakish, racy figure that had all these affairs with married women. And this had a profound effect on the young David. And this may have had, some impact on his, I keep calling it priggish, because it really is. You can't actually get that angry about it because it's quite funny. But yeah, I mean, we don't really know. We can't ask him. But certainly the attitudes towards gender in a larger sense are really interesting in when we look at what's going on in science fiction now, and were definitely worthy of a deeper examination.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Nina. And would Bob want to have a quick comment on how that gender expansion, might fit with Gnosticism and the Gnostic attempt for embodiment?
Yes. I mean, let me say, colleagues, I'm using Gnosticism as a catch-all here. It's a much contested kind of term. And one thing all scholars would agree on is that it's pluriform. There are some strains of Gnosticism that are deeply anti-feminist. Where the Sophia Prunikos is the female principle that is actually responsible for this simultaneous creation catastrophe event. But it's also true that early Gnostic movements often did accord much greater equality to women than the Great Church. And there are also mythological representations of the female that are much more empowering, symbolically empowering, than in the Great Church, their enemy and the adversary throughout. So I think it can be read as a kind of expression of that Gnostic experimentation with gender that is present in these primary texts, albeit it can be read in both regressive and emancipatory terms.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. Okay, I've got two questions here that are pretty straightforward in the sense that there must be a yes or no answer. So I'm asking them together. From Anna Vaninskaya in Edinburgh, was Lindsay interested in Swedenborgianism? And from Robert Lloyd Parry, did he write any short stories? Who would like to? Yeah, Doug, go for it.
I just wanted to add a comment to the last question, and then I'll get to this one. I pretty much agree with what Nina said, and find the use of the third gender pronouns quite remarkable. I will say that Lindsay, in his own domestic environment, after his father abandoned the family and his brother was older from him, he lived for 20 years among women, his mother, his sister, and his aunt. After the father left, the aunt's husband died, and they lived next door, so they combined the household into one. So from about 1895 through his marriage, Lindsay lived amongst basically women who, in a sense, served him as housekeeper, cooks, etc. And it would be hard not to see that as sort of formative in some of his views. But I would also add that a comment I think Louise Mill made in the comments, saying that in most of the later books, women serve as muse to the male writer, the male figure in the thing. But I would love to see someone take on that as a whole topic and cover it. Anna asked about Swedenborg, and I'm sure Lindsay must have been interested in him. And unfortunately, his library was disposed of right after his death, and we don't really have a record of much of what he read beyond mentions here and there, either in books or in his sketch notes, which is where he mentions the Russian writers, Dostoevsky, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Jakob Bohm would be another one who might have had tinges of Gnosticism that introduced Lindsay. And what was the other question, Dimitra? Robert Lloyd Parry's question?
The short stories.
Lindsay wrote no short stories, none. The only other thing he wrote was a short little blurb that was published in The Stork, which was the house organ of Putnam's when they were publishing Devil's Tour in 1932. It's a little article that says, basically the themes of my book are blah, blah, blah. Fate made visible and that. So no short stories at all, sadly.
Great, thanks for that. I'm just realizing now we are at the point where we're supposed to finish. Are we happy to stay about 10 more minutes? Panelists, are you okay? Good. Okay, so I'll try to ask as many as I can. I've got a question here from Alexander for Bob. Could some Gnostic ideas found in Lindsay's texts somehow influence Tolkien's writing, or the latter was too Catholic to be influenced by such ideas? So do we have a Gnosticism sort of thread that goes through all the way to Tolkien?
What an absolutely fascinating question. I feel unqualified to answer it, really, despite being a Tolkienite. I would share the view which Harold Bloom also echoes in his essay on Lindsay, that the inkling Christianity and what we are offered, the anti-theology we are offered in A Voyage to Arcturus, are deeply incompatible. Just as hence Pullman weaponizes, and anti-inkling himself, of course, weaponizes Gnosticism against the great church. So although I think Tolkien, with his immense erudition and his linguistic and scriptural sensitivities, would have been perfectly aware of these Gnostic allures, and one could certainly see, perhaps the greatest Gnostic in the Lord of the Rings is Saruman, the dangers of believing that knowledge rather than faith redeem us. I think he would have been perfectly aware of that, but I think it would have scared the pants off him.
That's fair enough. And I suppose most scholarship has looked at Tolkien as a Neoplatonist in some ways, rather than, the sort of Godhead and then the smaller gods.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question from our own Rob Mazel, my co-director. He says he'd love to hear more about Lindsay and the Pilgrim's Progress, which Nina pointed out, he's often associated with this work. Would anyone want to have a go at that question? No?
Have not.
I would love to hear about it too.
I mean, I always think of we're talking about a text that actually influenced a lot of contemporary fantasy anyway, as a text that was read as a fantastic text at its beginning. I usually take our fantasy students up to the special collections and show them some of our very early editions of Pilgrim's Progress as a narrative that is very much allegorical, but at the same time it was read if you read it on the surface as a quest,
it's a classic quest narrative, a template almost. So
in some ways I think a lot of modern fantastic literature is sort of in dialogue with Pilgrim's Progress, but there we go.
And Dimitra, might this not also be implicated in this question of style, that we are participating in a genre which presents itself as science fiction, as fantasy, as a modern 20th century modernist novel, but it is deeply indebted to the discursive practices of a very different kind of genre, the romance, and the quest, with its sense of ceremonial performance, that one is acting out of a certain register that is quite alien to novelistic realism.
Absolutely. Doug, yes, go for it.
I wanted to add that it sort of pulls a bunch of this together, is there is a real skein of medievalism all through Lindsay's books, which often does not get remarked. And The Witch is basically a medieval dream vision. You could also apply that potentially to Arcturus. You're left hanging, indecisive as to whether it is or isn't, but it could be in that sense. But you get the whole bit of the northernness and Surtur and Muspel from the Eddas in Arcturus. You get some background of the Anglo-Saxons in Haunted Woman. You get more of the sagas in Devil's Tour. I mean, and in The Witch, one of the significant characters is the medievalist Gaspery. And so you get discourses of, starting to lose my voice, but that is an important vein that runs through Lindsay.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And it leads into the how do you place Pilgrim's progress in that. And part of the problem, I think, in comparing Lindsay to that is the direct allegory you get into it, which Lindsay denounces in Devil's Tour when one of the characters, says allegory is like a painting with a label attached.
Right. Excellent. Thanks for this, Doug. And that actually answers Carsten's question towards the end about Norse mythology references in Arcturus. And as you said, Doug, it is all over, his oeuvre in many ways. I've got a sort of biographical question really here. Was David Lindsay's relation to fin de siècle occultism, anything beyond, what we see in Arcturus? Did he, any of his friend or family participate in Blavatsky's Theosophical Society or Golden Dawn, any of those movements? Do we have any evidence of that?
You want me to take that?
Yeah, go for it first.
Okay. There's no real evidence of it. There's an anecdote, I think, in Lindsay's letters to E.H. Visiak, where he mentioned something about, there was a huge cracking sound, that appeared, and everyone came running down the stairs and found nothing. Nothing was different, but they felt it was some sort of occult occurrence in a sense. And you see the same thing happens with the seance in chapter 1 of Arcturus, but we don't have any real, direct associations beyond that. Of course, second sight, Scottish second sight figures predominantly in Devil's Tour. Yeah, so he clearly was interested in exploring those areas.
Yeah. Good.
Stephen Sutcliffe says there are references to spiritualism in Sellen's book on Lindsay. So I'm sorry, I can see people's webinar, the chat thing, but I don't know how to respond to it directly.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm sure, I love this conversation can continue online as well. I am going to take one last question, and I am now, very, very conscious of, Bob being recovering from COVID, Doug losing his voice, everybody getting tired. The screen time is very tiring as well. So as a last one, which I think is a good one to end on, is from Clementine. Could panelists say something about Lindsay's later life? Did he die fulfilled as a human and as a writer? Was he recognized sufficiently in his own time? When did the Scottish canon embrace him? So I would love a comment from each of you, especially from Doug on the biographical element here, Nina on where she thinks the canon is looking at him right now as a practitioner, as a writer, and also Bob from his extensive experience of writing on SFF. So yes, Doug, the biographical question first.
He basically considered. I have no doubt that he believed in his work himself to the end, but he also believed it was a failure commercially, and he wasn't able to get. Violet Apple was never published. He had increasing difficulties. I don't know how many publishers some of the other books went through and to before he finally would get one interested. But he seems to have been a somewhat fatalistic person. When World War II started, he lived in Hove, and one of the first attacks on Hove, actually in July of 1940, the bombs went off right in his neighborhood in the early morning when he was in his bath, and the glass shattered, fell on his window. The window shattered and fell all over him and caused a great loss of blood. He ceased writing The Witch because he felt he couldn't concentrate on it. His death certificate actually lists him as retired author, though there are hints that had he, once the war was over and had he lived on longer, he might probably have gone back to The Witch. But there is definitely a sort of streak of, might call, fulfilled pessimism in his late life. So go on to Nina and Bob. I want to hear what they have to say.
It sounds to me, from what I've been able to discover, that the actual end of his life was really, really sad, and he was sort of plagued by debts and, very unwell. But he did have this enduring belief, and I think he'd be absolutely thrilled that here we are, it's 100 years later, and here we all are discussing A Voyage to Arcturus. And in a way, we're fulfilling his own prophecy about his work. And I think, you know, insofar as the Scottish canon, I mean, there's been, you know, in the last 30 years, obviously Scottish writing is undergoing a marvelous renaissance in, you know, in the fantastical sphere as well as in the gritty realism sphere. And Arcturus is an amazing sort of forefather of this radical spirit in Scottish writing, which is one of its defining characteristics. And, you know, the quest for knowledge and the quest for higher learning, as it were, as set against the rigors of the world. You could actually say it's a peculiarly Scottish novel. And, I find that fascinating, and it seems to be undergoing a new vigorous renaissance, which is wonderful.
Thank you, Nina. And Bob, would you like to?
Just very briefly, Dimitra, come back to that first anecdote with Douglas Gifford at Strathclyde University. And I think, as always with Douglas, there was much more going on in that smart-assed comment than a 17-year-old would recognise. I think we've discovered a kind of dark Calvinism in the last 40 years that we see has a kind of Gnostic taint to it. I'm fascinated by the Glassites who Mary Shelley stayed with, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley stayed with, who were accused by the mainstream church of being Gnostics. It's that Baxter family in Dundee, and there is a dark Calvinist pessimism and fatalism that is integral to Scottish Romanticism and British Romanticism more widely. We don't fully yet, it seems to me, understand it, but I think we have a sense, and Douglas Gifford had this sense, I think, that Lindsey belonged to that ancestrally, by inclination, by formation, and that, it seems to me, would have guaranteed him more attention for his later works and a revisitation of Arcturus had he even got another 5 or 6 years of active writing life.
Thank you ever so much. That's Doug, you have one last.
I just had one closing point. I just wanted to say that it's two of our best Lindsey scholars who are no longer with us both wrote books on Scottish literature, which included chapters on Lindsey, and that's J.B. Pick, whose book is called The Great Shadow House, and one by Colin Manlove, who only passed away a few years ago.
A few months ago. Yep.
A year or two? But anyways, but for considering the breadth of Scottish use of the fantastic, those are great places to start.
Thank you so much for this. That's been an absolutely brilliant event. We've got over our usual time, which is not how we usually do things, but the discussion is, could potentially go on for longer, but I can't keep our panelists any further. Can I just say thank you so much to Doug Anderson joining us from Michigan, and to Bob joining us from here in Glasgow, and to Nina from the Isle of Bute. And also thank you to everyone from all over the world, seriously, that joined us this evening for this conversation. And for those of you on Discord, you can continue discussing. If particular questions come up that you want to send to the center email, and I can relay them to our speakers, that can also happen. I just want to very briefly say that at the moment, and we are cooking up something interesting as a Christmas event. I don't have the, I'm not allowed to say yet what it is, but you're going to find out pretty soon. So watch our blog and watch our Twitter and Facebook updates on that. And also there's all sorts of exciting things coming up in the new year, including, of course, GIFCON, our annual conference on fantasy. So all of that will be with updates on our blog and our social media. So can I just one last time say thank you to our panelists, and I will close the session here. Thank you and goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.